That night, my daughter-in-law suddenly sat down beside me, in the house that was so familiar even to the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks of the door. The yellow light from the living room shone on her face, and I will never forget that thoughtful look. She spoke softly, slowly, as if weighing each word. "Dad, have you ever felt lonely?" I remember that moment clearly. My heart seemed to stop for a beat. Such a simple question. But why did it make me overwhelmed with a series of mixed emotions? Surprise, confusion, even a little panic that I did not dare to name. I knew, from that moment, something unusual had begun, and I also knew, if I did not tell this story to you, it would forever weigh heavily on my heart, like a stone that I would never have the strength to remove. My name is Tran Van H. This year I am over 50. People often say that men at this age have passed the halfway point of their lives and should be calm, content, find joy with their children and grandchildren, and live a life without any more turmoil. I used to think that I would be like that. After more than 30 years of working and saving, I am proud to have built a solid house, provided my son with a proper education, and married a wife to settle down. I often laugh and tell my friends, my life is complete. There is nothing more to dream of. However, life never follows the script we have drawn up. I naively believed that everything around me revolved around farming, a few village meetings, and family meals with the laughter of my children and grandchildren. But it turned out that beneath that layer of calm, there was still an undercurrent that I had never anticipated. I live in a small countryside. The whole village knows each other, and all the big and small stories are passed around in just a few morning markets. Perhaps that is why people often keep their thoughts and words, living so that no one can criticize them. I used to be such a man, always careful, always afraid of other people's words, always telling myself to set an example for my children. But the longer I live, the more I realize that sometimes that standard shell unintentionally imprisons people in an invisible cage, making them not dare to admit their truest feelings. I am not a perfect man. I had reckless youth, working hard to make my family better off, sometimes neglecting my wife and children. Then, when I had enough money, I realized that my relationship with my wife was no longer as passionate as it was in the beginning. The woman who has been with me for 30 years now seems more like an old friend who shares responsibilities, rather than a confidant who understands every hidden corner of my heart. We still live in the same house, eat at the same table, but the silence between us is sometimes more frightening than the arguments. I always thought that this gap was normal, an inevitable consequence of a long-term marriage. I got used to it, until my son got married. My daughter-in-law, that young woman, entered the house with a gentle smile, a soft voice, and gentle eyes. At first, I just considered her as a young girl who had to get used to the house rules, had to learn how to live in her husband's family. But the more we lived together, the more I realized that she had something that I had lost long ago: the ability to listen. She listened to every little story I told, from stories about the crops to memories of my youth. She asked about things that even my wife no longer cared about, and it was that unintentional concern that planted a strange feeling in my heart, a feeling that was both warm and dangerous. Have you ever experienced a moment when someone accidentally touched a void in your heart, making you feel as if you had just found yourself in someone else's eyes? That was the feeling I experienced. I knew I was not allowed. I knew that the boundary was so fragile that just one wrong step could mean I could never turn back. But then, just one question: Dad, have you ever felt lonely? A seemingly harmless question pulled me into a spiral with no way out. That night, It rained. The sound of the rain falling on the porch seemed to emphasize each word she said. I looked at her face and saw a vague sadness. My daughter-in-law was so young, she should have been happy and joyful with her husband. But there was something very different in her eyes, a sympathy, an emptiness that I did not expect to reflect myself. I did not answer right away. I smiled awkwardly, hiding the turmoil that was rising in my heart. But in my heart, a series of questions rushed. Is he lonely? What is he looking for in me? And me, am I really as happy as I think I am? Dear friends, I tell this story not to brag or to flatter myself. In fact, I feel more ashamed. But perhaps, only by telling it, I can feel a little relieved, because, from that night on, I knew my life would never be the same again. And if you are still here, listening to me, then be prepared, because what happens next may surprise you as much as it did me. After the night my daughter-in-law asked me that question, I suddenly realized that I had changed. The change was not in the way I ate or slept, but in the thoughts that crept into my head. Before, when I came home from work, I usually just wanted to lie down on the bed and turn on the television to make some noise in the house. But now, I pay attention to the light footsteps in the kitchen, the soft sound of dishes clanging together. I pay attention to whether my daughter-in-law laughed a lot today, whether she was tired, and especially, if she ever looked at me with the same eyes as that day. I told myself, it must be because I'm too sentimental. I'm old, why do I think so much about a child? But that strange feeling kept haunting me. Then the incident started with a small thing, but it was enough to ignite things I could not have expected. That day my son went to work far away. He was often away from home. Construction work is like that, leaving early and coming home late. Sometimes only coming home once a week. My daughter-in-law stayed home alone, taking care of the meals, and also taking care of me and my wife, although she rarely paid attention, leaving almost everything to her daughter-in-law. It was also raining that day. Summer rain, persistent, as if deliberately bringing back memories of the night before. I came home late, soaked, and accidentally slipped on the steps. It didn't hurt much, but my leg, which had been injured when I was young, was now swollen and aching. I crouched down, and before I could regain my composure, my daughter-in-law ran out, her eyes worried. "Dad, are you okay? Let me help you inside." I was a little embarrassed, but I didn't have the strength to object. She put her arms around me, gently supporting me, and for some reason, I felt an indescribable closeness. Her hand was small, but strong, supporting me step by step. In the room, he took a dry towel, carefully wiped the mud off my pants, then hesitated. "Dad, it must be very painful. Let me see if there is any medicine." I looked at him. His eyes were full of sincerity. At that moment, I felt strangely weak. I had lived my whole life as a strong man, supporting my family. But just for a moment, I wanted to rely on the care of a young girl. I smiled reassuringly. "It's okay. I'm used to it." This leg used to hurt at the construction site. Now, when the weather changes, it hurts a little. He sat down opposite, his eyes suddenly filled with sadness. "Me too. Sometimes I feel like I'm used to loneliness." That sentence, once again, was like a knife piercing my heart. I stopped, looking at him for a long time. People say, the loneliness of a man in his twilight years can be understood. But why would a young woman, just married, say such words? I couldn't help but ask, Why do you say that? Your husband loves you and is diligent in his work. What do you lack? She pursed her lips, gave a faint smile, and then softly replied, There is no shortage of material things, but emotions. There are times when I feel like a shadow in this very house. My heart tightened. I understood what she wanted to say. My son was addicted to work, rarely at home, and even when he was at home, he was not tactful with his words, and rarely cared about his wife's feelings. I had witnessed him being grumpy and irritable many times, while my daughter-in-law just silently endured. In her eyes at that time, I saw myself from many years ago, a man who only knew how to work, forgetting the company of his wife. And now, I witnessed a loop again, but this time, the one who suffered was my daughter-in-law. I didn't know what to say. Just sighed softly. My child, it's hard to avoid feeling empty at times in life, but try to maintain happiness, because it's not easy to have a warm home. He nodded, but his eyes were still sad. At that moment, in the room without laughter, only the sound of rain falling on the porch and the strong smell of ointment, I suddenly saw an invisible string tying two people who should never have sympathized so much. I knew I was stepping into a dangerous line. From that day on, every time I met his eyes, I felt my heart beat strangely. I told myself not to think, not to let myself go too far, but then, small incidents kept piling up. Sometimes, he cooked my favorite dish for me. Sometimes, he sat down to listen to me tell stories about his youth. Sometimes he suddenly asked me questions that no one had ever asked in his life. And I, who seemed to have become numb to emotions, began to feel my heart like a fire rekindled after years of ashes. Do you believe it? A man in his 50s, with two different types of hair, could be nervous just because of a fleeting smile from a young girl. I found myself ridiculous, but I couldn't deny the truth. The night I slipped and was helped into the room by my daughter-in-law was the turning point. Without her, I probably wouldn't have realized my weakness, nor would I have dared to face the loneliness that was gnawing at me every day. But once the door opened, it was hard to close again. I began to be afraid. Afraid of the eyes of the world, afraid of the constraints of morality, and afraid of myself, when deep down, I knew clearly. Between me and my daughter-in-law, a story beyond control was budding. Ever since the night my daughter-in-law led me into the room, my heart has not been as peaceful as before. I thought that it was just a passing thing, that I would forget it quickly, but as time went on, I found myself being drawn to it uncontrollably. Every morning when I woke up, I no longer only cared about farming or daily chores. Instead, I paid attention to what my daughter-in-law was wearing today, whether her hair was tied up high or loose, whether her face was smiling or had a hint of sadness. Those seemingly small things made my heart flutter like a young man falling in love for the first time. I knew that those thoughts were wrong. I reminded myself, "You are my father-in-law. She is your son's wife. You are not allowed to think." But how could a weak mind resist the rapid beating of my heart? Then one time, I remember forever. That day, the weather was hot and sunny. My daughter-in-law had just finished washing clothes and was busy hanging them out to dry. I walked by, intending to go to the back garden. Suddenly, I saw her small hands trembling, tying the clothes on the pole, sweat beading on her forehead. At that moment, a feeling of both love and pity arose in my heart. I approached, intending to say a few words of support, but then hesitated, not knowing how to open my mouth. She turned around, caught my eyes, a fleeting smile, gentle yet distant. "Where are you going, Dad?" I scratched my head awkwardly. "Ah, Dad went to the garden to see the areca trees." She nodded slightly, then continued with her work. But that look, that smile, was strangely engraved in me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my heart filled with torment. I knew I was changing. I was afraid that if this continued, one day I would lose my boundaries. Then, a small incident happened. One evening, after dinner, my wife went to the neighbor's house to help with the funeral. I was at home with my daughter-in-law. Suddenly, the power went out, and the whole house was plunged into darkness. I reached for the old flashlight, but the battery was low. In the dim light, my daughter-in-law sat down next to me and whispered, "Dad, you must have had a lot of memories when you were young, right?" I was a little surprised. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I see. You often sit alone. Sometimes you look sad. I guess you have a lot to tell, but no one to listen." I kept quiet. She was right. For many years, my wife rarely paid attention to the trivial things in my heart. My son was busy and rarely sat down to listen to his father reminisce about the past. Only she, a daughter-in-law, cared about things that no one else thought were important. So I began to tell. I told about my youth, the hard years at the construction site, the times I fell off my bike, the nights I stayed up all night watching the concrete. She sat silently listening, nodding occasionally, her eyes shining with sympathy. When I stopped, she said softly, "Dad, actually, I also feel like you in the past. Always straining myself. But no one understood. No one shared." I was shocked. In the dim darkness, her words rang out clearly like a confession. I turned around, intending to say something, but when I met her eyes, we both fell silent. At that moment, the distance between us seemed to be erased. I could clearly hear my heart beating strongly, like a drum urging. But immediately, my reason screamed, "No, you can't go too far." I quickly stood up, pretending to cough. "Ah, the flashlight must be broken. I'm going to find a candle." He also bowed his head, saying nothing more. That night, when I lay down on the bed, I felt my heart in turmoil. I knew clearly that a dangerous bond was forming between us, growing tighter and tighter. Once it broke, something irreparable would happen. However, there was one thing I had to confess. I didn't want to cut that bond. On the contrary, I longed for it, like longing for warmth in the cold winter night. Day after day, we didn't talk much, but the silence was full of meaning. Every glance we exchanged, every fleeting smile, made me confused. I began to live in a state of conflict. I wanted to avoid it, but I couldn't give up. One afternoon, when my wife went to visit her grandmother in the countryside, there were only me and him in the house. I sat on the porch, watching the red sunset on the horizon. It walked out and gently placed the cup of tea in front of me. It was a simple gesture, but I felt my heart tremble. It sat down next to me and asked softly, "Are you happy, Dad?" I was stunned, not knowing how to answer. In half my life, have I ever asked myself if I was happy? I turned around and saw its eyes both gentle and filled with deep sadness, and I understood that the question was not just for me. At that moment, I saw clearly. We were sliding down a path that neither of us dared to name. A forbidden path. But the more we avoided it, the more we were drawn in. There are times when I wonder if that night my daughter-in-law hadn't asked me, Have you ever felt lonely? Would my life have been as peaceful as before? Maybe. But then I realized, wasn't that question just the last straw that broke the camel's back? That camel's back had been full for a long time, ready to overflow at any moment. The more I tried to avoid it, the more I saw its presence clearly in every corner of my daily life. A fleeting smile, a gentle nod, a meal she served with a dish I liked, all of them made my heart flutter. And then, what I feared the most happened. One night, we stood too close to the line that we were never allowed to cross. That day, the wind turned. The rain lasted from afternoon until late at night. My wife had gone back to her hometown for several days and hadn't returned yet. My son was working far away. In the house, there were only me and my daughter-in-law. He knocked on my door, his voice trembling. "Dad, the electricity in my room is short-circuited. I'm so scared. Please come and check it for me." I followed him. The small room was flickering with flashlights. The smell of dampness wafted through the air. I fumbled to check, discovering that it was just a loose wire, nothing serious. But when I turned back, I caught his eyes, clear but filled with an indescribable sadness. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together, sighing. "Dad, sometimes I feel lost. My husband is always away. I'm at home with invisible emptiness. I don't know who to confide in." I paused. Those words were like an echo from my own soul. Over the years, I've felt exactly the same. A terrible loneliness. Even when living with my partner, I sat down on the chair, trying to keep my voice calm. "Son, I understand, but marriage is like that. It cannot always be shared. Be patient." It looked up, its eyes filled with tears. "But if you are patient for too long, will you still find yourself?" That question made my heart ache. I was about to turn away, but it suddenly grabbed my hand. The hand was small, cold, but transmitted to me a strange source of heat. My whole body froze. In that moment, all principles, all ethics, and morality seemed to disappear. I could clearly hear my heart beating wildly. I wanted to pull my hand back, but somehow I didn't have enough strength. We looked at each other. The look was long, heavy, but also full of attraction. I saw its eyes shining in the dim flashlight, and I knew, if I took one more step, we would never be able to go back. I jumped up, quickly stepped back, my voice trembling. "No, I can't do that. Neither can Dad." He was stunned, his lips trembled, then he turned away, hiding his tears. I stood there, panting, cold sweat pouring down my forehead, despite the rain and wind outside. From that night on, he and I were like two people carrying a secret together. We still lived normally, still maintained our father-son etiquette in front of everyone, but between us, there was an invisible crack. A crack that the more we hid it, the wider it became. The conflict inside me grew bigger and bigger. Every time I looked at my son, I felt guilty. He was my son. I taught him to live properly, to uphold morality. Yet I almost betrayed him. I blamed myself, told myself to end it all. But every time my daughter-in-law quietly served dinner, every time she accidentally met my eyes, all that determination disappeared. Once, I heard the neighbors whispering, "Mr. H's daughter-in-law seems to be very sad." Sometimes I see her sitting alone on the porch crying. Hearing that, my heart ached. I knew, Maybe she cried because my son was indifferent, but maybe also because of me, because of the wrong emotions that she didn't know where to hide. I started avoiding her. I made excuses to go to the fields more often, rarely coming home for dinner. I tried to build an invisible wall between me and her, but the more I avoided her, the more miserable I became. Every night, I lay down listening to the wind whistling, remembering her tearful eyes. One night, when I was sitting quietly on the porch, she brought me a cup of tea. Her voice was gentle. "Dad, I'm sorry." I was surprised. "What are you sorry for?" She bowed her head, her voice choked. "For making you confused, for making you feel guilty. I shouldn't." But I couldn't hold back. My heart ached when I heard that. I wanted to hug her, to say that I was like her. I couldn't hold back either. But I didn't. I just looked out at the dark sky. My voice choked. "My child, we have to keep the boundary. If we cross, there will be no way back." He was silent, but his shoulders trembled. I knew. Inside, he was torn like me. That night, I stayed awake. I felt like I was torn in two. One half longed for sympathy, warmth from him. The other half screamed to keep my honor, to keep my family. And I knew this conflict would never disappear. It would follow me until the end of my life. Since the night he apologized, there has been a strange silence between us. No more half-hearted questions, no more eyes meeting for too long. We live as if nothing had ever happened. But you know, silence does not mean everything disappears. Silence is just like a thin shell, covering up the undercurrents that are rolling inside. Every day, I still sit at the dinner table with him, still hear him cleaning in the kitchen, still see his hunched figure on the porch. On the outside, everything is no different from before, but in my heart, every second and every minute is filled with remorse. Many nights, I lie facing the wall, listening to my wife's steady breathing beside me. My heart is in turmoil. I ask myself, was I wrong from the beginning? Wrong for letting my old heart flutter for someone I absolutely am not allowed to? I remember my son's eyes every time he comes home from work trips. He hugged his wife enthusiastically, even though the hug was a bit hasty. I stood there, watching, feeling like a sinner. He was my son, blood and flesh, yet deep down, I had longed for the unforgivable. I began to avoid staying home when we were alone. I made excuses to participate in more village activities, even trying to make friends with old friends, so that I had a reason to go out early and come home late. But ironically, the more I avoided him, the weaker I felt. Because just a fleeting smile from him could make all the walls I had built collapse. Once, when I passed by, he whispered, "Don't worry, Dad. I know where the limit island." That sentence made me speechless. He understood. He was as hurt as I was, but we were both forced to keep it a secret. As the days passed, no one but us knew the secrets that had piled up. Outsiders still praise my warm family, my virtuous daughter-in-law, my hard-working son, and my happy grandparents. They don't know that behind that happy facade, I live every day with a wound that never heals. Sometimes, I think about confessing to my wife, or finding some way to free myself. But then I become a coward. I'm afraid of the family falling apart, afraid of the world's gossip, afraid of my son's disappointed eyes. I choose to remain silent, choose to hold that torment in my heart. There are nights when I turn over, remembering the moment he held my hand, remembering the sparkling eyes when he asked about happiness. I know clearly that there will never be a complete answer, because there are stories that are not allowed to end, that can only be left hanging halfway. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset. He brought me a cup of tea, gently placing it down like many times before. We didn't look at each other, didn't say a word. But in that silence, I could hear every beat of my heart strong, rapid, and full of torment. Perhaps this will be the secret that follows me to the grave. A secret without a name, without a confession, but enough to weigh heavily on my heart for the rest of my life. And if you ask me, do you regret it? I wouldn't know how to answer. Because feelings are inherently not sinful. It's just that circumstances have turned them into taboos. I regret letting my heart beat in the wrong place. But I also can't deny that, in those moments of weakness, I found myself a man who once knew how to love, who once knew how to desire, who once knew how to listen to the call from deep within his soul. The question that night still echoes. Dad, have you ever felt lonely? And until now, I still haven't found a definitive answer. Perhaps the real answer will forever be buried in my eyes, and it's on that fateful rainy night.